From the newsrooms of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, this is Inside Politics from Please Explain. I'm Jacqueline Maley. It's Friday, January 19. It's tough times for supermarkets this week.
The big supermarkets are officially on notice. The Albanese government launching a review of the Food and Grocery Code of Conduct to try and combat soaring prices at the checkout.
Prime Minister Anthony Albanese says farmers are providing cheap produce to supermarkets, but the low prices aren't being passed on.
When supermarkets are getting goods cheaper, the prices should go down. When that doesn't happen, then there's something wrong in the system.
The PM says all options are on the table to force supermarkets to ease cost of living pressures on consumers, even the option of significant government intervention. Then opposition leader Peter Dutton started a culture war by attacking Woolworths for not stocking Australia Day merchandise, including thongs emblazoned with the Australian flag. Dutton urged consumers to boycott Woolies over this outrage.
I would advise very strongly to take your business elsewhere, to go to IGA or Coles or Aldi.
Meanwhile, Foreign Minister Penny Wong copped criticism for her itinerary on her visit to Israel, and the Chinese ambassador gave a press conference in Canberra which took an interesting turn. Joining us for Inside Politics, we have Chief Political Correspondent David Crowe and Economics Correspondent Rachel Clun, and later Foreign Affairs Correspondent Matthew Knott will come on to talk about Israel and China. David and Rach, Happy New Year and welcome.
Great to be back.
Happy New Year.
David, can you first of all just tell us why Anthony Albanese has the supermarkets in his sights and what exactly he's proposing to do?
It's basic politics, but it's also economics. I mean, a lot of households are seeing the rise in prices at the supermarket. And I think the government talked last year in very general terms about improving competition in the economy. And I think they were a bit slow to really get out there with something concrete that could improve competition. We know that supermarkets are one part of the economy where there's probably, I think fair to say, not enough competition. Coles and Woolworths have 70% of the market. Aldi has another 10%. So this month, Anthony Albanese has started talking in much more concrete terms about doing more to help at the supermarket.
We want to see supermarkets do the right thing by their customers.
And the other challenge, of course, is that he can start a price inquiry by the ACCC. He has begun an inquiry by a former Labor Cabinet Minister, Craig Emerson, who's looking at the Grocery Code of Conduct to try and get better prices for grocery suppliers. But this is a slow process. That's not going to help consumer prices within months. So it's only part of what the government's doing on cost of living, but it's where the action is at the moment.
I mean, they need to be seen to be doing something, don't they? Rach, I sort of see this as the government doing its best to convince voters that it's focused on the issues that matter most to them, namely, sticky inflation and the feeling that all of us are kind of going backwards when it comes to cost of living. Inflation across the world, across history, is a notorious killer of governments and it's a worldwide problem. Is there anything else Albanese can actually do to tackle the inflation problem beyond sort of looking at supermarket prices?
I guess the important point to start with is they've got a really fine line to walk here between, obviously people want help. The government had a surplus in the last financial year. It's pretty likely that they might have a surplus come the May budget as well, so they've got the money to spend. But on the other hand, if they tip too much extra cash into the economy, they risk keeping inflation too high for too long, which is not a great, I guess, political kind of message, but economically it's really important. So they're in a really tough bind there. I spoke to a bunch of economists this week who are fairly unanimous in their calls that anything the government does here has to be well targeted and it has to be fairly timely. So looking at things like increasing Commonwealth rent assistance, which the government has already done, but increasing that further, maybe increasing the job seeker payments, single parenting payments, potentially extending the energy bill relief that they introduced in the October budget when they first came into power. Those sorts of things that really focus on the people at the bottom end who are doing it toughest with these high grocery prices, with, high fuel costs, all that sort of thing. It affects a smaller proportion of the overall economy. So any kind of injection of cash the government does there will have a smaller impact on inflation. So those sorts of things are things the government could look at. And they've promised that they will, unveil some new things ahead of the May budget. So I think something in that space is what we could expect.
David, this is Anthony Albanese's last full year of governing before he goes to an election, and that's if he doesn't call the election for later this year. In 2023, he focused mainly on the failed voice referendum, which probably didn't earn him a lot of points with voters at the end of the day. How much can we expect the government to pivot to talking about economic issues this year, and what indications do we have about what they're going to focus on this year?
Well, I think they're going to totally focus on the economy and on the cost of living. There are international pressures as well, such as the Middle East, but I think the message from last year is that Anthony Albanese has to focus relentlessly on that domestic agenda, and that's why he's already out with some remarks. He's going to make a speech to the National Press Club this coming Thursday. That's going to set the agenda for the year. He has increased his language or stepped up his references to doing something before the May budget.
Well, we'll be making announcements in the lead up to the budget. I've asked Treasury and Finance to continue to come up with ideas in ways in which we can assist with cost of living, but without putting pressure on inflation. And
now, I think that there's a very strong chance that they will do something on energy bill relief.
Mm-hmm.
But getting back to Rachel's points, it helps people who are on lower incomes.
Mm.
There's a political problem there. He can't offer money for everybody because that's only going to fuel inflation. So they have to be targeted, but I don't think there's any question there's going to be some action on this front, not just for the political reasons, but for the economic reasons.
Okay. And Rach, one thing some economists have said is that the planned Stage 3 tax cuts, which sort of give tax back to the big end of town or to higher income earners, are going to fuel inflation. But Albanese's not budging on those, is he? What did he say about that this week?
Well, there's been an interesting slight shift in the way the government's talking about it, emphasising the fact that this gives people more cash in their pockets. And he's been really talking about the fact that these tax cuts start from people earning $45,000 a year. Now, it's important to note, I think, that people on the lower end of the income spectrum are not going to get much cash back in their pay when they see it a fortnight. I think if you earn $50,000 a year, it's a few dollars a fortnight. Whereas if you earn, $100,000 a year, you're more likely to actually notice more of that money back. But the fact that they're talking about it as a form of, cost of living relief is really interesting and telling.
Yeah.
This also makes their options when it comes to cost of living relief a bit trickier because, as you said, economists, understand that this will add to inflationary pressures, so we'll keep inflation a bit higher for a bit longer. And that limits what the government can do in the May budget in terms of extra cost of living relief.
I just want to switch quickly back to the supermarket wars, or the supermarket wars of a different nature, because Peter Dutton this week made some really interesting and quite extraordinary comments, I thought, about Woolworths, which was reported to have stopped producing or won't sell this year for Australia Day the usual Australiana merchandise that they sell, including the Australia flag thongs, which some people might have been attached to. He said that people should boycott Woolworths as a result of this decision. It was really interesting because Peter Dutton is not popular. Our Resolve political monitor shows him as being on, I think, about 28% as preferred PM compared to Albo, who's 42%. He's yet to launch any major policy ideas which will give the coalition any sort of forward momentum. And yet he makes this quite populist play that is obviously aimed at quite conservative voters who don't want to change the date of Australia Day and sort of are patriots. David, what do you think his strategy was here, if he had one, or was he just sort of shooting his mouth off when he was on 2GB radio?
I think that there's a history of Peter Dutton going a bit further than he might otherwise do when he's speaking to Ray Hadley on 2GB. They get along very well. And so I think here Ray Hadley was picking up on some tabloid news coverage about Australia Day merchandise and pressing Peter Dutton on this. And Peter Dutton said very clearly Australians, if they weren't happy with what Woolworths were doing, should boycott Woolworths.
I think it's an outrage, to be honest, and I think people should boycott Woolworths. I would advise very strongly to take your business elsewhere, to go to IGA or Coles or Aldi. And I think until we get common sense out of a company like Woolworths, I don't think they should be supported by the public.
I don't think it's working at that level where he needs things to be working for him this year. This year is a different year for him. He had a great success in defeating The Voice in 2023. Things are different in 2024. The key difference is that this is the point at which, 1 year out from the next election, which I do think is odds on for early 2025, he has to fill the economic vacuum on the coalition side, have some policies, but he's also got to not only be the future Prime Minister for people angry about Australia Day, he's got to broaden that base. And he didn't do it with his remarks on Woolworths. And I think the fact that they're not talking every day about a boycott of Woolworths shows that they realise they picked the wrong battle.
As a former checkout cashier for Woolworths, I feel personally affronted. Thank you both very much. We're going to segue to foreign affairs now, Rach, so thank you for your assistance as always, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks so much, Jack.
Welcome to Matthew Knott, our foreign affairs correspondent. Matt, can you fill us in on the controversy around Penny Wong's trip to Israel this week?
Well, the controversy around Penny Wong's trip really reflects the controversy around this issue in Australia and the very passionate and very different views that people hold on the conflict and that the parties in Parliament hold. Penny Wong's been copping a lot of criticism both from her left in terms of the Greens and some elements of the Labor Party, and also on the right from the coalition pro-Israel advocates in Australia. And this is the context in which she's now gone to the Middle East 3 months after the attacks of October 7. And everything about this trip has been closely scrutinised, from her itinerary, where is she going, who is she meeting with, how long is she spending here and there, and then the substance of what she says on the trip. How critical will she be of Israel? How critical will she be of Hamas? All this is being watched very closely.
And what are the main criticisms that the opposition in particular has over the itinerary for her trip?
Two things. On terms of the itinerary, one of the decisions Penny Wong made was not to go to one of the communal communities, the kibbutzes in southern Israel that was attacked by Hamas on October 7. Now, many foreign ministers, other politicians who visited Israel have visited these sites, but also several haven't. US Secretary of State Anthony Blinken has been to Israel several times and hasn't visited one of these sites. The foreign ministers of Canada and Japan didn't visit these sites. They went for meetings, and instead of going to one of these sites, Penny Wong decided to meet with relatives of hostages who were taken into Gaza. The opposition says that this would have been a symbolically important thing to do to show solidarity with Israelis and also to send a message to Jewish Australians back here that Penny Wong gets the gravity of the October 7 attacks, but she decided not to do that. The other thing that's been floating around is this issue of the South Africa's case against Israel in the International Court of Justice and this genocide charge that Israel is facing. The government has been quite tight-lipped about it. They're saying that we respect the independence of the court, and that's brought criticism from the coalition and pro-Israel advocates who say that Australia should be defending Israel and saying that we don't believe they're committing genocide in Gaza.
I mean, the government has said that just because it accepts the independence of the court doesn't mean it accepts the premise of this particular case.
Yes, that's what Penny Wong said this week. That's really the strongest, most detailed comment that she's given on it. Right.
Just on a related issue, the ABC has copped a lot of criticism over its sacking of a radio presenter, Antoinette Lattouf, after she made social media posts on this conflict. She's taking legal action to sort of redress the injustice that she says was done. How will the government sort of handle that? Is it something that will impose itself on the government? And have they said anything about it?
There have been responses in Canberra to it, but it's not a question of government policy. But I see it as something that is a proxy dispute, if you like. There's a conflict in the Middle East. A lot of the questions in Australia are about what people say about that conflict and what side they take and what implications there are. In this case, it's for the ABC. How does it manage a situation where it has stopped the services of a journalist, because of something that she's posted on social media that I think many regarded as being, more in favour of the Palestinian side than the Israeli side. Okay, now that's the dispute there, but it is causing concern in Canberra. The government will not dictate editorial lines to the ABC, but the government does have to look at the ABC and see how it's responding to these kind of questions. And I think that what our newspapers reported this week about the WhatsApp group that was formed and the way the ABC responded to these demands that it dismissed the reporter.
This is Michael Batchelard's story showing all the WhatsApp messages between, I think it's Lawyers for Israel group, so pro-Israel lobbyists converging all to lobby the ABC and write letters asking them to sack this reporter.
They were Jewish Australians who had an opinion about how she was presenting the show and what she had said on social media. They wanted to express their opinion to the ABC, as they are totally justified in doing. That's the way, a free democracy works. The question for the ABC is how it responded to that. They say that they made a decision without any outside influence, but there is concern in government. And we saw that this week because our colleague Olivia Ireland asked the Industry Minister, Ed Husic, what he thought about it. And he expressed a concern about people being sacked for what they believe. Now, he did not want to get directly involved in the Antoinette Lattouf case. He avoided a specific reference to, her treatment. But I think the implications of his broad statement were pretty clear. He doesn't like it if people are being sacked because they might say something that appears to support the Palestinian side. I think that it's pretty clear this is going to end up in Senate estimates. It's going to be a question for the ABC. There's a legal case that Antoinette Lattouf is prosecuting against the ABC, but there is also going to be this broader question for the ABC about how it has handled this. Senate estimates is a logical forum for that to come up. And there's one other thing in the background. There are messages from the ABC chair, Ita Buttrose, about this. Her term expires in March. The government has to find a new chair for the ABC. So at the moment, that becomes a more complicated decision, I think, for Anthony Albanese and federal cabinet in terms of how they look at how the ABC is being run at the moment, when clearly there's a lot of disaffection within that organisation among its journalists.
I want to turn now to China because on Wednesday the Chinese ambassador gave an extraordinary press conference and both of you guys were in attendance. He said a lot of stuff. I think it was quite a long press conference, but in amongst it he demanded that Australia stop meddling in China's affairs. Matt, can you set the scene for us?
Yeah, so this has become an annual tradition for the Chinese ambassador in Canberra. Is at the start of the new year, around now, the middle of January, he gives a press conference. One or two journalists from each of the major outlets is invited to come to the embassy in Canberra. And he gives a talk at the start about his reflections on the past year, where he wants to take the relationship this year. And then journalists are allowed to ask questions. Now, I think the intention was for this to be a very convivial, friendly, positive event. The ambassador spoke about how last year relations in many ways between Australia and China got back on track, with trade relations improving, with Anthony Albanese going to China for a meeting with Xi Jinping. This was all progress, and he said we want to elevate things even more this year. But from his answers to the questions, it shows how big the gulf still is between Australia and China in many ways over so many of these issues between Taiwan, the Pacific, this incident involving Australian naval divers that China disputes Australia's characterization of it. It shows that while we're getting trading relations back with China, there are huge differences here and the relationship's not going to go back to what it was a decade ago.
Just tell us quickly what he said about the Navy divers, some of who their ears was damaged by what we think was Chinese sonar, right?
Yes, this was in November. This was a big incident. Australia has said that China's behaviour here was dangerous. Perhaps someone could have died, that they do take this very seriously. China has throughout denied that they were responsible for this sonar attack. What changed with the ambassador's comments was that he said not just that China was not responsible, he said, well, you should take a look at the third country that was around at the time, which was Japan. Now, Japan and Australia, of course, have very friendly relations. We're close defence partners here. This was seen as a pretty remarkable look over their strategy that hasn't impressed Japan at all or the Australian government.
I think there is a sort of a jarring aspect to this. In many ways, the ambassador is very friendly. He began with a toast using Australian red wine. He talked about Australian red wine being exported to China within months. He talked about being friends, not foes. He highlighted this, what he saw as a future where there was peaceful coexistence between China and the United States, with Australia also enjoying that peaceful coexistence. At the same time, I think he's very effective actually in putting that case. But he's also unedited in the way that he presents the core Chinese positions with which Australia cannot agree. And that's one of those inevitable things about the relationship, those differences.
Gentlemen, thank you both very much for joining us. It's been fascinating as always. And Dave, we'll see you next week. Matt, we'll see you again soon.
Thank you, Jackie.
Cheers, Jackie.
Today's episode of Please Explain was produced by Chi Wong with technical assistance by Debbie Harrington. Our executive producer is Ruby Schwartz. Please Explain is a production of The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. If you enjoy the show and want more of our journalism, subscribe to our newspapers today. It's the best way to support what we do. Search The Age or smh.com.au/subscribe. I'm Jacqueline Maley. This is Inside Politics from Please Explain. Thank you for listening.